Hey, there's somebody said something. That was good. Y'all doing good today? Yeah. Would you tell me if you weren't? Probably not. Somebody said yes. Who said yes? All right. You guys have your Bibles open, hopefully already. Matthew 26. And hopefully after Caleb came up and read, by the way, he's sneaky. I'm standing at the back door waiting on him to come in after Sunday school, and so I must have looked away for just enough time that he slipped by, and I caught Ryan walking by, and like, what, you're not sure, where do you, anyway, y'all don't care. Okay, so anyway, just so you know, I plan to have people start reading our sermon text because I think it's good for us to be, for others to be involved in our services today, so if you see me coming your way or you see my number and you don't want to do that, just ignore me. Because it's coming. So anyway, I want you all to be involved in our services on Sunday morning. So if you don't already have your Bible open it up to Matthew 26. We're going to look at verses 17 to 30. And what am I forgetting? Our kids. Oh my goodness. I prayed over all these babies, got me distracted. If our kids want to go to children's church, they may do so. I forgot to tell them. Did most of them already go without me telling? Yeah, well, I apologize. Thank you for flagging me down. Are
we going to do communion?
Yes, we are. Just not yet. I didn't forget that. No worries. I remember that. If you didn't hear what Caleb read, he read about the first Lord's Supper. So I thought it would be appropriate for us to walk through the text, and we're going to take that closer to the end of the service. So we are going to be talking about the Lord's Supper today. Some call it communion. There's a fun word that may have been heard. Maybe you've heard this before. Have you ever heard of the Eucharist? Anybody heard that term? Okay, it actually comes from the Greek word that means to give thanks. And as Jesus takes these elements and gives them out, he gives thanks for them. It's where the term Eucharist comes from, but it's just another name for communion. Maybe you've heard of it as one of the church's ordinances, or maybe you've heard a fun word like sacraments. It's a word I prefer to avoid for reasons I'm not going to get into today. Anyway, you may have heard all of those things. So I may use Lord's Supper, I may say communion, probably not going to call it the Eucharist, even though it's fine. But I'm talking about the same thing. But as we start talking about communion, we might start asking ourselves, what is this thing? Like, why do we do this? Why do we receive these elements? Why are we taking these elements? What does it really represent? And what should I be thinking about while we do this? Does it matter? Like, all of those, I think, are good questions to ask, and I think a lot of them get answered. Now, many of you know the answers to those questions, and you're thinking, Jared, this is pretty basic stuff. But I'm going to argue that sometimes we're a little bit short-sighted when we come to the table, whenever we come together for communion. I think sometimes we're a little short-sighted because whenever we come to take communion, and I'm guilty of this too, just so you all know, we're really good about looking back, right? We look back to what Jesus did, right? Y'all with me? Is that something that even crosses your mind whenever you take communion? Are y'all awake? There we go. A few of you are getting the bobblehead thing going on. There we go. Okay, so we look back. We think about what Jesus did, and certainly that's right. We should reflect on what Christ has done. But as Jesus institutes this thing that we call the Lord's Supper, or we call communion, what we find is he's actually looking ahead. Now, part of that is the time where he is, but we're going to see that he's looking even beyond where we're at today. He's looking further ahead. And hopefully what we can see is all these things that Jesus is looking forward to. Now, up here I said Jesus looked forward to 4 things. Okay, now what we need to understand is whenever I say he looked forward to, I don't necessarily mean that he was like, oh yay, this is going to happen. Okay? What I mean is he's looking ahead in time. He's looking forward in time to these things that he knows are going to happen. Okay, so that's what I want us to see, these things that he was looking forward to, looking ahead to as he instituted this ordinance, this thing that we call the Lord's Supper, this thing that we call communion. And hopefully, as a result of our time, we have a better understanding of what communion is and what we're doing as we receive these elements. But even more than that, I don't want it just to be like, okay, now I know more about this church ritual. I hope that you see how this changes the way that we live. It's bigger than just what we do on Sunday mornings. This has impact for every day. And I hope that we can see that. So we're going to kind of walk through the text. I'm going to do my best to mark it up, and hopefully I'm already broadcasting and we're ready to roll with this thing. I'm getting a nod, so that's good. So, as we look through this, there's four basic parts as Jesus is looking forward, and that's these four things that he's looking forward to. And the first of these, Jesus is looking forward to the Passover meal. Okay? That might sound pretty simple, but he's looking forward to this Passover meal. Okay, verse 17, it says, on the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, where do you want us to make preparations to eat the Passover? Okay, where do you want us to make these preparations? All right. Now, this leads us to believe that we're dealing with the Thursday of Holy Week, all right, of the week leading up to Jesus' crucifixion, which happens on Friday. Okay, the Passover lamb, it would be slaughtered, and its blood would have been drained on the first day of unleavened bread, on Thursday. That's when this would have taken place. So on Thursday, the sacrifice was made, blood drained. I know that's maybe gory, but that's what happens. And that flows right into the night that Jesus is betrayed. He's handed over and he's put on trial, and eventually he is crucified. All right, but what day is he crucified? Anybody? What day is Jesus crucified? Friday. Good Friday, right? First one didn't seem like a Good Friday, but it's Good Friday. So we know he was crucified on Friday, but right now we're on the first day. So we're on Thursday, which rolls over. Now, this sounds odd because all of this is taking place on this first day. Shouldn't this be the same day he's crucified? Well, we have to understand first century Jewish audience and the way they perceived days. Okay? A new day did not start at sunup or at midnight. A new day started when the sun went down. So on Thursday, these sacrifices were made, then the sun sets, and they have the meal then on Friday. That evening, after the sun has set, they have their meal together. All right, so all this Thursday rolling into Friday. And because the time for the Passover came, the disciples realized, hey, we need to prepare for this feast. This seems like something we probably ought to get ready. Okay, they're probably right. But what we need to stop and we need to think about is this is not a small question. We read it and they're like, okay, so where are we going to go set the table? Preparing for this feast, preparing for this meal was bigger than that. Because remember, they're in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem at the time of this festival would have been incredibly swollen in population. Like it would have exploded in population. People coming from all over the place to celebrate this festival. So now they have to find a place that's available for 13 plus people to come and stay and to have this meal around the table together. Not only that, but then they have to have the sacrifice that has to be made. Then they have to make sure that they got drink and everything else that goes with the sacrifice. So they have to have all of this stuff prepared. And given the regulations for the feast, this is a loaded question. Where are we going to go to make this preparation? Like if I was one of these disciples, and it's now Thursday, and we're going to be eating this meal that evening, like going into Friday, I'm probably in panic mode. Thinking we want to celebrate this, but we have not prepared. Not a small question. And by the way, the son had to be eaten after sundown. And for those living in Palestine, it was either eaten in Jerusalem or they weren't allowed to eat it at all. Okay, so now they got to find a place in the city with all of the stuff that goes around it. They come to Jesus like, Jesus, where are we going to do this? But Jesus reminds them of the significance of this Passover, of this meal. Actually, to help you understand it, I think Luke helps us a little bit. Luke 22:15, Jesus said to them, I have fervently desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. Jesus, in this particular case, was longing for this time with his disciples. Whenever I say looking ahead, I mean he was looking forward to this, like he was going to enjoy this time where he had this meal with his disciples before he suffered. And they seem up to the task, so they ask him, where are we going to make these preparations? How are we going to get all this done? But the good news is, like always, Jesus seems to be on it. And he says, go into the city to a certain, and I love this, to a certain man, he said to them, and tell him, the teacher says, my time is near. I am celebrating the Passover at your place with my disciples. Jesus has this all figured out already, doesn't he? See, the disciples, they look at this like, where are we going to do this? Where are we going to prepare this? And Jesus says, it's okay, I got this handled. And whenever he says, go into the city to a certain man, it almost seems as if he knows who this person is, and Matthew just doesn't think it's important to recite his name. Like, he says, go to this guy. This is the guy that knows where you need to be. He's going to tell you everything you need to know. Go to this guy. We don't know if Jesus had made arrangements ahead of time or if this is a display of his omniscience, like he knew that this was going to happen. We really don't know. And ultimately, it doesn't matter. But what we do know is that Jesus has everything under control. He has it all under control, knows how it's going to play out, so he sends his disciples ahead to this unnamed man. And in verse 19, we find something that seems pretty simple, doesn't it? It says, so the disciples, they did as Jesus had directed them and prepared the Passover. Now, that seems incredibly simple, doesn't it? All right, Jesus told them to go do this, so they did it. That may sound simple, but that's really hard, especially whenever you think of the enormity of the question that this first century Jewish audience would have understood. Like, you're telling me just to go to this guy and it's all going to be taken care of. Just go. Now, the disciples throughout the next few chapters, they're going to get a pretty bad rap. And rightfully so, right? One of them's going to betray Jesus. One of them's going to deny Jesus. The rest of them are all just going to abandon Jesus. They're all going to turn tail and run away. And even after Jesus is raised from the dead, some of them are going to be like, yeah, but that couldn't have really been Jesus. They're going to doubt him. So let's just pause for a minute and give them a little bit of credit. Jesus tells them, like, all this is handled, go to this man, and they do it. They're faithful. They go. All right, so Jesus here, tells them to go and prepare this Passover with this certain man, and they go and they do it. So Jesus looks forward to this Passover. But that leads us to the next thing Jesus is looking forward to here. Jesus is looking forward to his betrayal. And again, I don't mean he's going to enjoy his betrayal, but he knows it's coming. So he's looking ahead to his betrayal. It says, when evening came, and again, when evening came, all right, so next day, according to a first century Jewish audience, when evening came, he was reclining at the table, and this is really important. This is incredibly important here. He was reclining at the table with the 12. And you'll see why that's important here in just a minute. So he's sitting here at the table with his guys. And whenever the evening came, it signals the end of the day. And now the meal is to be eaten because it's after sundown. And Jesus is here with his guys. And then he says to them, in verse 21, while they were eating, he said, oh, and here's this word, these words that should just like clue us in that Jesus is about to say something important. He says, truly, I tell you, one of you will betray me. One of whom? That's why that 12 is so important. One of his guys. One of his guys. One of the 12 that he's here reclining at the table with. One of you will betray me. Now, we have to keep in mind that Jesus has been living with these guys. He has been traveling with these guys. He's been working with these guys. These guys have done miracles in Jesus' power. They've seen some extraordinary things happen because of Jesus. And now Jesus is sitting here having this meal, saying that one of his closest followers, one of his best friends, is going to hand him over, is going to betray him. Now, just let that sink in for a minute. Because if this were you just spent, let's just call it 3 years, because that's the easiest number, because everybody thinks like Jesus ministered for 3 years or so, right? So let's just say 3 years. You spent following this guy. You were dedicated to this guy. And now he's sitting here at this table saying, one of you guys is going to betray me. Like your best friend is sitting there saying, one of my closest friends is going to betray me. How are you feeling in this moment? This guy's done extraordinary things, seems to know the future. Like this guy has just blown your mind time and time again. He says, you are going to betray me, one of you. It's not somebody outside of this group. It's somebody right here in this room at this table. One of you is going to turn your back on me. I'm going to be hurt by that. I don't know about y'all, but I hear that, I'm thinking, really? That's serious, right? That's going to scare me. That's going to worry me a little bit. And guess what it does to these disciples? Notice here, verse 22, they're deeply distressed. They feel the weight of this. So they're deeply distressed. Each one began to say to him, surely not I, Lord. Surely it's not me, is it? Now, this word distress, it means that they were grieved deeply. Actually, the word in the Greek is lupeo, and it's a very intense word in the Greek. Okay, a very intense word. It's so intense that sometimes it was used to describe labor pains. That's the pain that they're feeling emotionally. Like the weight of this thing is just ripping them apart. It's eating them up. And because they're so pained, they tell him one after another, "Not I, Lord." And they're convinced. Each one of them is convinced, like, "No, I'm ready to follow you even if it costs me my life. Like, I'm going to follow you. Like, I wouldn't betray you, would I? Like, I wouldn't do that. I'm never going to turn my back on you." And I love this because in my mind, I get this visual of them sitting around this table and one after the other says, "It's not me. It's not going to be me. I'm not going to betray you. I'm not going to betray you. Surely not I, Lord." Pledging their allegiance again to Jesus. And as they deny this possibility of their own like them being the betrayer, Jesus speaks. And Jesus says, the one who dipped his hand with me in the bowl, he will betray me. He will betray me. Now, our English translations don't really do this justice because we read this and we think it's almost as if Jesus is identifying Judas in this moment in front of everybody, right? That's how I always read this. Like the one, like it's like this bowl is going around, and as it comes to Jesus or as it comes to Judas, and he dips his hand into the bowl, it's like the one who's dipping his hand in the bowl, he's the guy, and Judas just drops it like, nope. No, that's not how this happens. The one in the Greek is very ambiguous. It's basically Jesus' way of saying that somebody here at the table. D.A. Carson says it this way. He says, Jesus' point is that the betrayer is a friend, someone close, someone sharing the common dish, thus heightening the enormity of the betrayal. Like, it's one of these guys. He says, no, make no mistake, it's one of you that's going to turn his back on me and hand me over. One of my closest followers. So they all deny it. And as they do, Jesus says, no, it's one of you. And in verse 24, Jesus goes on. He says, the Son of Man, and again, that's one of Jesus' favorite self-designations. He says, the Son of Man will go just as it is written about him. But woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for him if he had not been born. Okay. The Son of Man, again, Jesus himself, he says that he's going to be handed over to death, but it's still not outside of his control. Still not outside of his control. Because look, he says, just as it is written about him. This may have been a shock to these disciples, even though Jesus has been trying to prepare them for this. It may have been a shock to them saying, hey, he's going to be handed over. But Jesus says, no, understand, this was God's plan from the beginning. Like this was written about him. He's going to go just as it was written about him. But he doesn't stop short there, right? He goes on and he talks about Judas and he says, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for him not to be born. Like he says, look, there's still a responsibility for Judas. Even though God designed this plan, like he orchestrated this plan from the very beginning, he's been writing about it for centuries, for thousands of years. This has been written about. But still, Judas is responsible for his actions. See, and I love that because we talk about human responsibility and God's sovereignty and how those play, and we think of them as being mutually exclusive, but Jesus almost says, no, these two things, they have perfect harmony. Like human responsibility, God has it all accounted for. It's all his sovereignty, and these things work together perfectly. Judas is still responsible, even though God orchestrates it. So Judas is still responsible, and because of that, he adds this woe and says it's better for him not to be born. Let me just tell you, like, if you are one who has turned your back and walked away from the Son of Man, handed him over to death, wanted nothing to do with him, said, I'm done with him. Like, the end is not good for you. I don't mean to just try to scare you or anything like that, but the end, it does not go well for you. So much so that Jesus basically says it's better if you had just never existed. It would have been better for you to just not exist. And that's what he says. He says it's already determined, and we remember that Judas has already determined and already been paid these 30 pieces of silver to hand Jesus over. And here in verse 25, he speaks. All right, now let's give Judas a little bit of credit. The guy's got guts. Okay? It says in verse 25, Judas, his betrayer, so now he's being identified. Judas, his betrayer, replied, surely not I, Rabbi. Why Rabbi here in verse 25? Because if you remember back to what all the other disciples were saying, it was surely not I, Lord. But now, as Judas speaks, he says, surely not I, Rabbi. And see, whenever I read this, I start thinking, well, maybe Judas just isn't giving Jesus the honor that he deserves. Because whenever we hear the word Lord, we think God, right? We hear Lord, we think Old Testament Yahweh. That's what we think. And it's almost like, well, Judas is not calling him God. He's demeaning, like he's taking a step down by calling him rabbi. But we have to remember, first century Jewish audience and who Jesus is speaking to. In this context, the word for Lord is kyrios in the Greek. So this word would have been a more generic term. It means like sir. Surely not I, sir. Whereas rabbi was a huge step up. A rabbi was somebody that people would devote their lives to following. So Judas, he's actually stepping up what the other disciples all said. They're going around, surely not I, Lord, surely not I, sir, surely not me. And Judas is like, surely not me, Rabbi. You all hear this, right? It's like he's covering what he's about to do, what he's determined to do. See, after Easter, this word Lord takes on a whole new connotation. That's when it got ramped up. But here, Judas wants to put on this show to cover his betrayal. But Jesus says, you have said it. You have said it. In other words, your words are condemning you yourself. You claim to be a follower while you're betraying me. He says you're a hypocrite. And notice, he pronounces this woe on him just like he did the religious hypocrites earlier on. He says you're numbered with them, those people who are going to be cast in the outer darkness where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. And he says, woe to you. Woe to this man, this betrayer. But remember, all of this is as Jesus looks ahead and knows his betrayal, but he continues moving toward the cross. But why does he keep doing this? Why doesn't he stop? Why doesn't he just out Judas and take care of the problem? Why not? Well, that brings us to the next thing he's looking forward to. Jesus looks forward to his sacrificial death. To his sacrificial death. Okay? Verse 26, it says, as they were eating. So they're here at this meal, they're eating. Jesus took bread. He blessed and broke it, gave it to his disciples and said, take and eat it. This is my body. And don't miss this. This is my body. Okay, now this is a pretty common scene at the time of the Passover. During the Passover feast, during the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, the head of the house would have taken the bread and would have blessed it, broke it, and distributed it. So this isn't all that uncommon a scene for this festival. And there were probably some traditional formulas that Jesus could have prayed, something like, blessed are you, King of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth. And after he blesses it, he distributes it to his disciples. But here, Jesus does something different. Like he puts this new twist in here. Whenever he says, this is my body, there is nothing in the Old Testament that would have pointed us to this. Like nothing that would have been a common formula here for him to say, this is my body. Jesus is putting a whole new meaning on this common scene. He says, this is my body. Now to understand what Jesus has just done by saying, this is my body, we need to actually rewind to the first Passover. Are y'all familiar with the concept of Passover and what the first Passover represents? Okay, if you're not, here we go. So back whenever the nation of Israel was still in bondage in Egypt, Moses comes onto the scene and tells Pharaoh, let my people go, right? And Pharaoh refuses again and again and again. So God brings all these plagues. And after 9 plagues, Pharaoh is still hard-hearted and refuses to let the people go. So God says there's going to be a 10th plague. And that's where we pick up because they're given directions for what they should do in Exodus. Okay, God says he's going to destroy the firstborn of every house, and here's what the people are told to do in Exodus chapter 12. It says, then Moses summoned all the elders of Israel and said to them, go, select an animal from the flock according to your families, and slaughter the Passover animal. Take a cluster of hyssop, dip it in the blood that is in the basin, and brush the lintel and the 2 doorposts with some of the blood in the basin. None of you may go out of the door of your house, of his house, until morning. When the Lord passes through to strike Egypt and sees the blood on the lintel and the 2 doorposts, he will pass over the door and not let the destroyer enter your houses to strike you. All right, so you guys get this, right? Like slaughter the animal, take the blood, put it on the lintel and the 2 doorposts, and whenever God comes through, the destroyer will not be allowed to enter the house that has the blood on the lintel and the doorposts. In other words, God's going to make a distinction between Israel and Egypt. He's going to make a distinction between his people and those who are not his people. And he's not going to allow the destroyer in. Now, the very next verse actually tells them to have this as an ongoing festival whenever they enter the land. So what we got to remember, though, is the lamb that was slaughtered and later commanded to be eaten in the house is the one who died to provide what was necessary for the people to be saved. And I'm going to say that again because this is incredibly important to understanding what Jesus is doing here. Okay? The lamb that they slaughtered is the one that had to die to provide what was necessary for the people to be saved. Lamb died so the people could be saved, right? Y'all tracking with that? Now, Jesus is saying that his body is that thing that died to provide them safety. His body would be broken so that they could be spared, bringing a whole new meaning to this Passover feast. He was going to be the one that would die so that the destroyer would pass over them. He was the one. He says, this is my body. But he goes on to verse 27, and it says, then he took the cup. Then he took a cup. And after giving thanks, and here's that word Eucharist, that's where it comes from. After giving thanks, he gave it to them and said, drink from it, all of you. Drink from it, all of you. Okay, so we get the idea. There's the broken body, but then there is the cup. And during the Feast of Passover, there likely would have been 4 cups with a different representation for each one. And I seem to remember Colby Lewis actually doing a communion meditation on this. Is that right? Yeah, I thought so. I thought he did one here a while back. And these cups represent a 4-fold promise that comes from Exodus chapter 6. So there in Exodus chapter 6, verses 6 and 7, God issues these 4 promises to the nation of Israel. And this cup that Jesus is taking here, giving thanks for, is likely the 3rd cup, which is known as the cup of blessing, reminding us of the promise that God made in Exodus 6:6. And here's what it says there. It says, I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and great acts of judgment. In other words, the promise that Jesus is reminding them of as he takes this cup is God's salvation, of his redemption. He says, take this cup, this redemption, and drink it. So Jesus commands him to drink, but listen to what he says next in verse 28. Listen to what he says next, because this adds some much needed context. He says, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. Okay, whenever he says this is my blood, this is his blood, he's pointing them again to his sacrificial death, that he was going to be poured out so that they might drink the cup of blessing, that they might have redemption. And notice he says, this is my blood of the covenant, which is for the forgiveness of sins. Jesus is telling his disciples that his blood is the blood that would save them. It's the mark of belonging to him. It's the thing that not only stops the destroyer, but also brings them entrance into God's kingdom, draws them back in. He has to die, or he says he has died, or he will die, as the necessary sacrifice, and his blood would bring safety from judgment and usher them into the promised land. And just like the old covenant, the Mosaic covenant, whenever he comes to his people and brings this new covenant, it's ratified with blood. Jesus says this new covenant will also be ratified with my blood. It'll be poured out so you know this is a new covenant and it is binding. So Jesus is pointing them forward, ahead just a few hours here, to the time when he would suffer and die, and in so doing, ratify this new covenant. But what in the world is this new covenant, this covenant that Jesus is talking about here? Now, this would have brought a ton of things to a first century Jew, like would have just made their minds just go crazy with all these references to the Old Testament. Maybe it was Exodus 24:8 that we read just a moment ago, or that was referenced just a moment ago. Or maybe it would have taken them to Jeremiah, where he says, there's a new covenant that's going to be written on your heart, and my law will be written on your heart. Like you see that there's this new covenant that Jesus is instituting, this bringing, and he's going to ratify it with his own blood. And this new covenant says that we become God's people and are forgiven of our sins. We are redeemed by coming to Jesus in faith, trusting that his sacrifice is enough. And then we follow him with our whole being. So Jesus is looking forward to this sacrificial death that ratifies this new covenant. But he's doing one more thing. I believe Jesus is looking forward to sharing in his kingdom. He's looking forward to sharing in his kingdom. We come to verse 29. Verse 29. He says, "But I tell you, I will not drink from the fruit of this vine from now until that day when I drink from it new with you in my Father's kingdom." Okay. He says he's not going to drink from it again. Now we know Jesus is getting ready to go and suffer and die. He's getting ready to go to the cross, and his life is about to be ended here on earth, right? Before he's resurrected and then spend some more time on earth. But y'all get the scene, right? He's getting ready to go to the cross where he's going to suffer and die. He's preparing for that. So he says, "I will not drink from the fruit of this vine." Now, this would have been a surprise, again, for these disciples who anticipated 4 cups. If this is the third, and they're anticipating a fourth, here's the shock to them. He says, "I'm not going to drink from the fruit of this vine again," while they're waiting for that 4th cup. They know the tradition. They're looking forward to the next step. So Jesus grabs their attention again. And he says, "From now until that day." He says, "I will drink it, just not for now." He says, "Not again until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." See, this is more than just Jesus saying he's going to wait. This is more than just Jesus saying, "Well, I'm going to be patient until you're ready for my kingdom too." It's bigger than that. This 4th cup, it points people forward to the final promise that was given there in Exodus chapter 6. And here's what it says in Exodus 6:7. He says, "I will take you as my people, and I will be your God." What Jesus is saying here, as he says, "I'm not going to drink from this again until I drink it with you new in my kingdom." What he's saying is that those who receive the promise from the 3rd cup will not be forgotten or left behind when the 4th cup is shared, and that these people who share with him in the 3rd cup are also going to share with him in his kingdom. He is going to be their God, and they are going to be his people forever. Y'all see that, right? Jesus isn't, like, we look at the Lord's Supper, we look at communion as a thing that points us backwards, but it's bigger than that. It points us forward to the new kingdom, to God's kingdom, where we get to share in the blessings of the kingdom with our King because of what he did in that 3rd cup. We remember that he's ushering in something greater. And he tells his disciples that his time is near, and those who trust him, they're going to join him in the kingdom. So, again, we need to think about both aspects, both the aspect of the forgiveness of this new covenant, but also the thing that is coming. And Carson, again, he points us to that. And he says the Lord's Supper, therefore, points both to the past and to the future. Both Jesus' sacrifice at Calvary and this messianic banquet. So, that's it. That's where we're at. What we need to do is we need to tie this all together, right? We need to bring this all together. And what better way than actually receiving this supper that Jesus tells us to remember this feast, this communion, this Eucharist, this thing for which we give thanks. So I thought this would be a good time. So if our servers would like to go ahead and come, we're going to receive communion now. If you guys want to go ahead and start passing those elements, I'll tell you all, we practice open communion. So if you are a believer in Jesus, if you have trusted in him as your sacrifice, as the one who died in your place, we invite you to participate with us in communion. So if you would take and hold these elements, we will receive them together here in just a moment. But while they're coming around, we take this time as they're coming, and I hope that you take it as an opportunity to be introspective. Actually, Paul, whenever he writes about this scene, he tells us to examine ourselves, to look at our lives, to really think things through. So that's what this is. As these are coming around, it's a chance for you to consider your life and make sure that your life is fully committed to Jesus, that it's fully his. And for some of you, that might mean that there is sin that needs to be confessed. That may be where you're at. For some of you, that may mean that there needs to be a recommitment, a sort of shift in your priorities. because you realize that your life is out of line with what Jesus demands. So maybe that's what it is today. Regardless, as these elements come around, I encourage you, examine yourself. Examine your life.